Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today I'm taking a look at the MSI GS65 Stealth Thin, which is MSI's new flagship gaming laptop with Intel's 8th gen Coffee Lake CPUs inside. A lot of you guys have been asking me to check out this laptop, so today we'll be going through hopefully everything you want to know. So the GS65 is essentially the successor to MSI's previous slim gaming laptop, the GS63, which I've looked at previously. MSI had used the GS63 design for a couple of generations now, but this new GS65 design upgrades many areas, including the hardware and design. It still uses a 15.6-inch 1080p display, but we're now looking at slimmer bezels and an upgrade to a 144Hz refresh rate. Hardware-wise, there's nothing out of the ordinary for a high-end laptop in 2018. The CPU is Intel's Core i7-8750H that we've reviewed previously, and the GPU is NVIDIA's GeForce GTX 1070 Max-Q. There's also 16GB of RAM and a 512GB SSD in my review unit, though that combination does vary in different regions. MSI clearly wasn't happy with Gigabyte claiming all the accolades for its slim bezel gaming laptop, the Aero 15X. So they too have gone this slim bezel approach here. The GS65's bezels aren't quite as slim as what we see with the Aero 15X, but they are much slimmer than on the GS63, and crucially, MSI has achieved this without giving us a nostril vision webcam. As you can see, the top bezel is slightly thicker than the sides, and in there, MSI has managed to fit in a webcam. With slimmer bezels comes a smaller laptop, and comparing dimensions reveals the GS65 to have a slightly smaller footprint than its predecessor. About 22mm has been shaved off the width with a similar depth, all while maintaining the same 17.9mm of thickness. These aren't massive figures, but any size reduction while still including the same hardware is welcome, and it keeps the laptop as portable as possible. Plus, it's still reasonably light at just 1.88 kilograms. I always liked the design of the GS63, but this new GS65 is simply a class above. It's by far the best looking MSI laptop ever, with an excellent metal shell and subtle yet attractive gold highlights around the lid, trackpad, vents, and more. Almost every area of this slim chassis has been refined. It now exudes premium quality. Small touches like simplifying the logo on the lid and removing other game elements have worked wonders, and if you remove the annoying stickers below the keyboard, the minimalist design only becomes more impressive. The key thing with the GS65 design is, despite opting for a high quality metal chassis, MSI hasn't compromised the cooling solution. There are still a ton of vents on this system, including the sides, rear, top, and bottom. We've seen with laptops like the Razer Blade that a metal design is good, but it can limit the cooler quite significantly. However, this doesn't appear to be the case with the GS65. Despite a significant amount of edge space going to the cooling vents, there are plenty of ports on this laptop. 3 USB 3.0 Type A ports, Thunderbolt 3 USB-C, Ethernet, HDMI 2.0, mini DisplayPort, and 2 audio jacks. Unfortunately, there's no SD card slot, which would have been handy for professionals. However, I am glad MSI moved the position of the power button back to a more sensible location above the keyboard. It used to be on the edge, and it was pretty easy to accidentally press it. Speaking of the keyboard, MSI has used their standard SteelSeries design with per-key RGB LED backlighting. Notably, there's no numpad on the GS65, which I tend to think should come with the 15-inch laptop. The Aero 15X, for example, does manage to cram a numpad into a similar chassis. Not a big deal for gamers though, it is mostly a nitpick. The travel distance from this keyboard is rather unimpressive. MSI has opted for an Ultrabook style switch with a shallow, rubbery response. I prefer a more clicky design, and I know it is possible with a laptop keyboard, but the limited amount of space MSI has allocated to the depth of these switches has no doubt constrained this keyboard's performance. On the other hand, the trackpad is very responsive and an improvement to the old Elan days, though mostly you'll want to use a proper mouse for actual gaming. Removing the bottom panel of the GS65 reveals a flipped motherboard, unfortunately. While you can see the battery and cooling components to a small extent, any access to the RAM and M.2 slots is fairly difficult, as you have to remove the entire motherboard and cooling assembly first. There are a lot of small, fragile connectors along the way, so it's not something I'd advise for the casual user. However, if you do want to go down that path, you will find a spare M.2 slot and a spare DIMM slot. Interestingly, MSI has used a triple fan cooling design here with a single cooler on the left for the CPU and a dual fan cooler for the GPU on the right. The extra fan for the GPU is a bit unique though. The heatsink design isn't anything unusual and actually provides a good amount of finned area, certainly a lot more than the Aero 15X. Before heading into performance, I did want to touch on the display. As I mentioned earlier, it's a 1080p 144Hz IPS type display, and while it doesn't include G-Sync, I do appreciate the high refresh rate, and I really hope this becomes standard in gaming laptops. Like with the bezel size, it's clear that MSI are targeting the Aero 15X with this display's calibration. While not X-Rite Pantone certified, the GS65's display is much more accurate than any MSI laptop I've reviewed in the past. It's not perfect, but an average CCT of 6804K is decent to go along with average delta E's of 2.2 in grayscale, 2.22 in saturation, and 2.73 in color checker. For the best results, these figures should be below 2.0 at least. However, considering past efforts, this is a pretty decent improvement. Unfortunately, perhaps as a result of tighter calibration, brightness and contrast are unimpressive. It does reach just 248 nits of peak brightness, and that's not great, and neither is a sub 1000 to 1 contrast ratio. Both of these areas are handily beaten by the Aero 15X, which packs a similar display and somewhat superior calibration. Let's move on to performance now, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this as I've previously covered a lot of this system's hardware in other reviews. The Core i7-8750H and GeForce GTX 1070 Max-Q combination I've covered extensively in previous stuff, so if you're interested in both CPU and GPU performance, I'd suggest checking out my original coverage of the i7-8750H. However, it is still important to benchmark the GS65 specifically to see if there are any performance anomalies or other interesting talking points relative to the original results we got for this CPU and GPU. And there's one that sticks out immediately: the fact this system has single channel memory compared to the dual channel configuration we used in our initial i7-8750H benchmarks. As I showed in my review of the Gigabyte Aero 15X, which also uses single channel memory, the reduced memory bandwidth provided by this sort of configuration does hurt both productivity and gaming workloads in some instances. This chart shows the performance difference between the MSI GS65 and our original dual-channel memory i7-8750H benchmark results in a range of productivity tests. Some workloads like encoding, rendering, and Excel are largely unaffected by single-channel memory. Others like the Adobe Suite, compression, and MATLAB are more heavily influenced by reduced memory bandwidth, and as such can be up to 29% slower. If you plan on using apps that are memory bandwidth sensitive, I'd suggest chucking in an extra stick of RAM to get dual channel bandwidth. How does the GS65 Stealth Thin fare in a direct comparison with the Gigabyte Aero 15X? Well, both of these laptops have single channel memory, and in most tasks you can see the GS65 is slightly slower. For the most part, we're only talking about a 5% performance difference or less, and this is down to a simple hardware difference. The Aero 15X uses DDR4 2666 for its single stick, which is the maximum DDR4 speed Coffee Lake supports, while the GS65 uses DDR4 2400. Again, this is something you can address yourself with a RAM swap, but with a 5% difference it might not be worth it in a lot of cases. If you're thinking of upgrading from an older laptop with the i7-7700HQ inside, you can expect to see hefty gains in productivity workloads. The i7-8750H provides an upgrade from 4 to 6 cores, plus clock speed boosts in every situation, which allows it to provide huge performance improvements in multi-threaded tasks. Cinebench R15, XL, 7-zip decompression, and X264 encoding all benefit the most, with gains up to 64% and typically at least 50%. More single-threaded tasks tend to see single-digit gains, but there's still an improvement here, so we'll take it. Here's the Cinebench R15 chart that shows how the GS65 stacks up in more concrete numbers rather than relative terms. Again, if you want to see more charts like this and more in-depth discussion on the i7-8750H, check my original coverage of that CPU and keep in mind the relative differences we've looked at so far. As for gaming with the GTX 1070 Max-Q, in general this GPU when paired with the i7-8750H is quite capable of 1080p ultra quality gaming at around 60 FPS in the latest titles. Obviously the most punishing games will tax this GPU a bit harder than that, as its performance sits between a GTX 1060 and a fully fledged GTX 1070, but overall it provides a decent experience. Again, as we're looking at single channel memory, some games don't perform as well as an equivalent system with dual channel memory. Games like Assassin's Creed Origins, Battlefield 1, Prey, and Mass Effect Andromeda are hit to a noticeable degree looking at 1% low results, with typical performance drops around 20%, though it can be as high as 40% in some cases. Other games like Rise of the Tomb Raider, Star Wars Battlefront 2, Dirt 4, and GTA 5 are less heavily impacted with either no performance drop or just single-digit drops. When comparing the GS65 to the Aero 15X, performance is pretty close on average, though the slower memory speed of the GS65 does have a small impact across the board. Some games exhibit a double-digit performance loss relative to the Aero 15X, while others are either equivalent or slightly faster. On average, we're looking at about a 3% difference, which isn't that much at all. We've found previously that in a like-for-like system configuration, you'll get around a 10% performance boost from the i7-8750H when moving from a Core i7-7700HQ, at least when the GPU is still a GTX 1070 Max-Q. However, again, memory bandwidth does have a say in this. If you're moving from a dual-channel 7700HQ system to a single-channel 8750H system, you'll actually see a performance loss on average, or at the very least, no significant gain in games. If you're deciding what GPU is right for you, here's a quick breakdown of how the GTX 1070 Max-Q slots in among other popular laptop GPUs. It's around 20% faster than the GTX 1060, but upwards of 12% slower than a full GTX 1070. And the GTX 1080 Max-Q tends to be around 25 to 30% faster. No laptop review would be complete without discussing thermal and acoustic performance. In such a slim laptop, you're never going to get amazing results in this department, especially with such powerful hardware, though MSI does do as much as possible to keep things in check. The GS65 is neither outrageously hot nor deafeningly loud as a result. When playing Watch Dogs 2, the GS65 CPU reaches around 89 degrees Celsius while the GPU sat at 86 degrees. Ideally, I'd like to see the GPU a bit cooler than that. That's fairly hot for a laptop GPU, but CPU temperatures are in line with other gaming laptops. In CPU-only workloads, you can expect the CPU to sit more at 81 degrees with no throttling unless you're running a power virus. Acoustics is where I was more impressed with the GS65. Under a Watch Dogs 2 load, the system's triple fan cooler produced just 44 dBA of noise, which is significantly quieter than its main competitor with identical hardware, the Aero 15X. The impressive Acer Predator Triton 700 edges both laptops out in this test, but either way, the GS65's cooler noise is relatively easy to drown out with game noise. In a CPU-only workload, handbrake encoding in this case, the cooler wasn't as loud at 40.6 dBA. That's mid-range for a gaming laptop of this size, though again notably quieter than the Aero 15X. As for battery life, the GS65 includes an 82 watt-hour battery, which is fairly sizable for a 15-inch laptop, but not quite as large as the 90 plus watt-hour units we see in the best devices. As a result, battery life is roughly where I expected for a gaming laptop. Not horrendous like the early days of gaming laptops, but not amazing either. You won't get Ultrabook battery life out of this system, but it is capable of a decent amount of usage away from the charger, especially if you're just doing light tasks like web browsing. Like with most portable gaming laptops, the MSI GS65 Stealth Thin is pretty expensive at $2,100 for the nearest configuration to what we used. It's not unfairly priced though, as competitors like the Gigabyte Aero 15X and Asus ROG Zephyrus cost a similar amount, and what you end up going with does come down to the features and other aspects in that case. When considering everything this laptop provides, I really like what MSI has brought to the table. This is clearly their best gaming laptop ever, bringing a superior design, smaller footprint, and improved performance compared to the GS63. The build quality is fantastic and the cooling surprisingly decent in acoustics, providing a better experience than the Aero 15X, its closest competitor in both aspects. My main concern is the use of single channel memory out of the box, which leads to reduced performance compared to a dual channel setup, though this is also an issue with the Aero 15X. However, the internal layout of the GS65 makes this problem difficult to fix on your own. It is fixable, just you'll need to take out the entire motherboard and be careful in the process. Aside from that though, MSI has really nailed this laptop. It's a great buy, and I love seeing companies continue to iterate on their designs and produce even more compelling hardware. That's it for this review of the MSI GS65. If you're interested in this laptop, you can check its current price using the links in the description below. Support us on Patreon, and if you're a fan of what we do, and I'll catch you next time.